I'm going to begin this afternoon just requesting permission to record, and I am recording this at this point just so that is documented as well. Thumbs up as well as any yes. If anyone has any issue with that, just chat. You can send me a chat. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone to our second presentation of the Spring 2002 Brown Bag series. My name is Marilyn Loyola. I teach Spanish here at Rockford University, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you all and to introduce our speaker today, Andrew Johnson. Andrew received his Bachelor of Arts degree in German and Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. His scholarly passion has long been German history and culture, while professionally, libraries are near and dear to him. Before coming to RU, he worked in several public libraries across Wisconsin and Illinois, where he established his place in each community as the German guy, excitedly teaching any who would listen about German history, translating German documents for genealogy clubs, and recommending German movies to check out. Andrew joined Rockford University in the summer of 2021, where he is the face of the Howard Colman Library as Circulation Services Manager. He always encourages anyone and everyone to ask questions, telling students, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. Please join me in welcoming again, Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Professor. Let's wait a moment as someone just joined in here. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question that was asked just before we started recording, asking why nation rather than folk is the phrase ein Volk too frightened with Nazi overtones. I will get to that answer in a moment, but I wanted to have that answer in everyone's mind. And let me start with okay, there we go. So, we begin. Herzlichen Willkommen zu meiner Präsentation. I'm happy to have you all here today. Now, before I get into the schnitzel and potatoes, I first offer my thanks to Dr. Ed Matthew and Tony Rowe. This presentation serves as a sort of indirect sequel to Ed's brown bag last semester on the geography of the Holocaust, as parts of what I say will coincide with the information that he presented. And though it's not my intent to go with a strictly geographic take on this, I do end up using a lot of maps, not unlike what Ed did last semester. And secondly, when after Ed concluded his presentation, Tony and I were discussing it, and she asked me the excellent question, why was Germany separated? Like her, you probably know or even remember watching what happened in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, Germany reunified, and so forth. But how did we get to that point? Why was Germany split after World War II? So now, Jules, I'll answer that question. I call this presentation Zwei Staaten, eine Nation, or two states, one nation. And this is a quote from a prominent East German author who gave a speech by the same title. In his speech, he argued the two Germanys should remain separate as two states sharing one nation. While this view was in the minority, it does raise the question, should Germany exist? That is to say, the unified singular nation state of Germany. This concept of the German nation is a recurring theme here, and that question of Germany's very existence was asked by many Germans during this period. So what's so special about the German nation? So part one is just about that and how we got to the point of separation. Now I am beginning here with the end, as these images are from the late 1980s, during the demonstrations against the East German authoritarian state, as this may be familiar to you who lived through this and saw the Berlin Wall on the evening news. the slogan "Wir sind das Volk," or "We are the people," was used in pro-democracy protests to mean the common masses of the people wanted change and would not accept their rulers and the status quo in East Germany. The second slogan, "Wir sind ein Volk," "We are one people," was later used to call for reunification, stating that the nation should be made whole again into one state. In some ways, both slogans were also an anti-Nazi slogan, as the Nazis were heavily focused on the nation and especially used the word folk to emphasize it, to go back to that question from the beginning. I'll get more to that as I get going here. So, the German nation can be traced back about 2,000 years, roughly, to the ancient Germanic peoples that existed at the same time as the Roman Republic. Until the last 2 centuries, though, they did not unify into a single state. I include this just to emphasize the age of the German culture and language compared to Germany itself. So long before Germany, was formed, there were many smaller German states. This map from the mid 1800s shows a much smaller version compared to earlier in history. But as you can see, it was a very fragmented, balkanized land compared to what Europe looks like today. Now, they were each politically independent and separate, but they were generally aligned, especially economically and to varying degrees politically in various confederations and customs unions and so forth. But the 1800s also saw the rise of nationalism in Europe, and the Germans were swept up in the desire to unite. In 1870, the largest of the German states, which here we are. You can see here the Kingdom of Prussia, this large blue country here. They led a coalition of the various German states against an aggressive, though manipulated into being so, France. And ultimately, the Germans won the war, and they created the nation state of Germany in early 1871. So this does mean that at 175 years of age, Rockford University does have a few years on the legal unified nation state of Germany, as an interesting tidbit for anyone for the 175 this year. So the King of Prussia was crowned as German Kaiser in Versailles, and Germany was officially created. This is a map of the pre-World War I borders, or the pre-end of World War I borders of the first legal unified Germany. You can see that it includes the current borders and a lot of land, west and east, that are no longer part of Germany today. So to jump forward in time a little bit more, we are now in 1919 and the Paris Peace Conference that ended World War I. As you all know, Germany lost this war. And with this loss came the end of the monarchy, the establishment of the German Republic, massive war reparations, and significant territorial losses. Now jumping ahead of myself, the French did briefly push to dismantle Germany, but the British and Americans were not on board with this. Thus, Germany lost large amounts of territory that we see here in this light blue around all sides of the country. Some territories were annexed outright, such as the French retaking Alsace-Lorraine, which the Germans had taken from that earlier war. And of course, Poland was recreated after having been dismantled in the late 1700s by, among others, the Prussians. And they were given the so-called Polish corridor, granting them access to the Baltic Sea up here in the north. Other parts of the country were allowed to have a vote on whether or not they would stay in the country or they would join another one, as what happened up here in Schleswig-Holstein, where the northern part was and is predominantly Danish-speaking, and thus they chose to go to the nearby Kingdom of Denmark, while most of the Schleswig-Holstein people in the south opted to stay with Germany, where they are still today. As a result of these territorial losses, a significant minority of Germans, that is to say, German-speaking people who consider themselves to be German, were no longer in Germany itself. This is important because the Nazis used this to aid in their rise to power, claiming that the German nation itself was fractured. Now we go forward a little bit more to the late 1930s. So the Nazis were hyper-nationalists. They loved using the word Volk, which means people, and the concept it represented to further their agenda. It was in their slogans, it was in laws, it was in projects, it was in products that were created. What I have here are just two singular examples, the Volkswagen and the slogan Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, in reference to the annexation of Austria, which happens in the late 30s. Their ideology demanded that Germans be reunited with Germany proper. And this is a core of their foreign policy, of course. Now, to finally address the last part of that question from the beginning, Jules, I will say that the word Volk itself should not be considered explicitly bad or a explicitly Nazi term. As I said, the word means people, or perhaps a bit more poetically, it can be defined as nation. And it has many uses well predating the Nazis co-opting it for propaganda. For example, we see here the dedication Dem Deutschen Volke, which is inscribed over the entrance to the Reichstag, the German parliament building in Berlin. This was added in 1916 during the First World War. And at the time, Germany was an absolute monarchy under the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was not a pro-democratic ruler, and he was very much against adding this inscription to the Reichstag building. This also means that I am not in any way suggesting that any company that uses the word Volk is in itself inherently Nazi or pro-Nazi or neo-Nazi or anything of that nature. It certainly is a loaded word these days because of the Nazis, but it is not explicitly a Nazi term, if that makes sense. Now, that aside, going back to what I was just saying about the Nazis' foreign policy and the demand to reunite Germans with Germany, their first external target outside of Germany was Austria. And in March 1938, the so-called Anschluss, or annexation, occurred. Austria was going to actually vote on whether to join Germany, but Hitler and the Nazis, fearing a negative outcome, Hitler decided to forcibly merge the two countries, and he sent in the German army, the Wehrmacht. Fortunately, no shots were fired, and it was ultimately a peaceful annexation. And also a great number of Austrians welcomed the merging of the two countries. There's a whole slew of history and politics that goes into why they didn't merge together originally when Germany was created, but we'll leave that for another day. Suffice it to say, they did merge in 1938, and that was the beginning of the Nazis' territorial expansions outside of Germany. Later in 1938, the Sudetenland crisis occurred, and the Sudetenland was this orange area here of what was then Czechoslovakia. And in the Sudetenland were a great number of Sudeten Germans, Sudetendeutsche, Germans who had been living originally in the Kingdom of Bohemia, or later the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were left in the Czech and Slovak majority-speaking country of Czechoslovakia as a result of 1919 in the Paris Peace Conference. So the Sudeten crisis was the next step of the Nazis' foreign policy of reuniting Germans with Germany, and they demanded the Czechs and Slovaks turn over this land, or else they'd go to war. The British and French, with the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, held a conference in September of 1938 in Munich, and it was agreed that the Sudetenland would be transferred to Germany and war would be avoided. This is, of course, where Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, gave his now infamous "I've secured peace in our time" speech upon returning to Britain. So the policy of appeasement existed, and there was hope that that would be the end of the Nazis and their external claims. Of course, this was not the case. Shortly, not too long after the Sudetenland was annexed, they annexed the remaining part of the Czech portion of Czechoslovakia, or formerly known as Bohemia. And the Slovaks were created as the Slovak Republic, or excuse me, the Slovaks were allowed to create their own state, but it was really a puppet state of the Nazis. And of course, what follows next is September 1939 and the invasion of Poland after the various false flag events in late August that gave the Nazis a casus belli to declare war. And World War II, 6 years of brutal fighting, millions upon millions of people being dead, many more injured, displaced, etc. Crimes against humanity committed on an industrial scale. And ultimately, we get to Germany surrendering in 1945. So that is my overview in a nutshell of German history prior to 1945. Obviously, I skipped a ton of material, but this is how we get to the point of asking for we can answer the question of how Germany was split and why Germany was split after World War II. So with this foundation, we can start to answer the question. Obviously, the war, that was why. Or more precisely, perhaps, both wars. World War II was built upon much of World War I. So bear in mind the hyper-nationalism of the Nazis as you consider the second part and the actual separation of the actual separation or partition of Germany by the victorious Allies. But I'm actually going to back up a little bit and go into during the war, because that's when the actual separation of Germany was plotted out. So during World War II, the big three of the primary allies against the Nazis, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, and later their successors, held in-person conferences to discuss the future of Germany in the post-war, as well as Japan. At these conferences, we see the beginning of Germany's separation into two states, although this was not a product of these conferences. That came later. One of the major outcomes of the first conference in Tehran, in what is now modern-day Iran, was the future of Polish borders. So Poland, of course, was defeated early on in World War II, and were once again removed from the maps as an independent state. Their government went into exile. So one of the major outcomes of the Tehran conference was, of course, the future German-Polish borders. So the modern-day German-Polish borders can be traced to this conference, and it is on what is called the Oder-Neisse line. These two rivers, the Oder and the Neisse, largely form the border, as you can see here, of the post-war Germany and Polish borders. This was, of course, another planned reduction in Germany's territory, just as there happened after World War I. So the next conference was at Yalta, and it is here where the forthcoming German partition became manifest. The three powers agreed to split Germany into three occupation zones between the three soon-to-be victorious powers. This is the basis for what would become the two Germanys. Yalta set forth a plan for the end of the war and post-war Europe, including the requirement for the complete unconditional surrender of Germany, the demilitarization and denazification of Germany, and of course, the partition of Germany. What we see here is one of the many different plans that were proposed for what to do with Germany. Now, this last point about the partition underwent significant discussion and change. Several plans were discussed, of which some directly called for the breakup of Germany, as this image that you can see here was one such. Those were the more extreme and ultimately rejected plans. The plans that led to the ultimately accepted one began with this, where we see Germany split into 3 occupation zones. The Soviet territory in this case is including the parts that were designated from the previous conference to be given to the recreated or revived rather Polish Republic. But we can see largely the basis for what would become East Germany and West Germany in these sections here. Now, you might know that France was also one of the 4 occupying powers in the post-war world, and that actually ended up coming a little bit later. So the initial plan had it in 3 chunks, as you see here. But the final plan ultimately broke it into 4 chunks. This is roughly what the war front looked like at the end of the war in May 1945. This purplish lavender area was about the farthest extent of the Western Allied troops into Germany that they then later left and turned over to Soviet rule. Again, you can see the beginnings of East and West Germany here, as this red zone and this lavender zone collectively make up what becomes East Germany. So these are the 4 occupation zones plus the territorial concessions given to Poland and also this little chunk up here to the Soviet Union, as well as you can see the 4 powers split Berlin in here in the center of the East German or the Soviet occupation zone. So the Polish gains are, of course, a consequence for the Germans to be given to Poland because Poland was the first victim of the war. And also, if you recall your World War II history, you will know that the Soviets invaded Poland a couple weeks after the Nazis did. And so very little of the territory the Soviets took ended up being returned to Poland. So as a concession for giving up that territory, they were given these territories of Silesia in the south and most of Pomerania in the north, as well as about half of the former East Prussia in the east. The Soviets took the remaining portion of East Prussia, which today the modern day Russian Federation still has and is known as the Kaliningrad Oblast. They took that because they wanted another Baltic Sea port. So I also say as an aside, the parts of Poland that were occupied by the Soviets in World War II ended up forming the basis for the post-Cold War modern day Belarus and a significant chunk of Western Ukraine. So that's what ended up happening to the eastern part of pre-war Poland. So with these formerly German lands changing hands, as well as reactionary attitudes due to the war and atrocities suffered under the German occupation in Eastern Europe, as well as fears of potential future claims of yet another war by yet more hyper-nationalists in Germany, we saw a great movement of Germans forcibly from Eastern Europe. This map shows approximately where Germans or German-speaking peoples were living in interbellum Poland, Ukraine, or Soviet Union, Romania, as well as the Baltics. That's what all these magenta sections are. So there were a lot of Germans that were not living in Germany itself. So to go back to what I was saying about the Nazis being hyper-nationalists, and one of their justifications for their pre-war actions being reuniting Germans with Germany, you can see what they're building some of that on, although these are, well, here's a little bit of the Sudetenland Germans you can see here on the edge of this map. So you can see where they were coming from as far as how they justified this. Now, the German populations in over all this were historic ones that had been there for varying amounts of time, depending on who you're looking at. The Baltic Germans, the Volga Germans in what is now Russia, people have been living there for centuries. Some other Germans that this map doesn't show, of course, came during World War II when the Nazis had their policy of Lebensraum, or living space, where one of the justifications for the Holocaust and the millions of people they murdered was to free up space, as it were, for future German settlers, some of which had begun to move into the occupied zones that were closer to Germany proper while the war was still happening. So with all these recent settlers and the historic German populations, there were a lot of Germans in Eastern Europe. And as a result of the war, they were forcibly expelled, or in some cases, they fled themselves, but there were mass expulsions of Germans. And many of them ended up going to post-war Germany, that is to say, the 4 occupied zones of what became modern-day Germany. Although that's not exclusively where they all went. There are still, to this day, a significant minority of Germans in Kazakhstan. There's also a lot of the Russo Germans ended up leaving Europe entirely and coming to America. So there was a lot of German movement during and after the war across Europe. So to return to the concept of the German nation and what exactly constitutes that, the Allies faced a question on what to do with Austria. While Germany was ultimately created without Austria, and as I said before, that's a whole other complex series of history, many Germans and Austrians still considered the Austrians themselves to be Germans and thus part of the same nation. Some plans for the post-war German landscape included Austria as a part of Germany or one of the post-German various states, while others, including the ultimately agreed upon plan, kept the two countries separate. Austria was at first viewed as a willing participant and guilty, along with Germany proper, of the atrocities of World War II. However, as the war's end neared, the Allies started to view the Austrians as the Nazis' first victims outside of Germany proper. While Austria was occupied and split into 4 occupation zones, which you can see here, including Vienna being split among the 4 powers, it was ultimately agreed upon that for the post-war world, the Austrian Republic would be a neutral country with permanent neutrality. The 4 occupying powers would leave, and this ended up happening about 1955, and Austrian independence was guaranteed. This left them out of the NATO-Warsaw Pact conflict, Cold War conflict, that gripped most of Europe for some 40 years after World War II. So, with Austria sorted out, that left Germany. Split into 4 occupation zones, the 4 powers discussed a solution similar to Germany that ultimately was not agreed upon. By 1949, the 3 Western zones had become closer as their occupying powers agreed to jointly administer their portions. Initially, after the war ended, the 4 occupation zones were administered separately, but the 3 Western zones ultimately became closer and closer together. By 1949, this was happening, and just before the 2 Germanys were created, East-West tensions were severely strained. Many of you will know of the Berlin blockade, a year-long blockade of the 3 western zones of Austria, or of, West Berlin. And that basically the Soviets wanted to have all of Berlin, and the three Western allies would be kicked out. The other option, which of course is what ultimately happened, was the Berlin airlift. The Berlin airlift was a famous humanitarian effort that for over a year, the Western allies, to include the larger Commonwealth, Canada, South Africa, and so forth, of the collapsing British Empire, participated in a massive humanitarian effort to fly in everything that West Berlin needed to stay alive, lest they starve or freeze in winter and be forced to give in to Soviet demands. This massive effort at its peak ended up seeing a single plane arriving every 30 seconds, and the turnaround time for these planes to be offloaded and sent back to the Western zones was about 30 minutes. As you can imagine, seeing with this image here, it was the singular hope for the hundreds of thousands of Germans living in West Berlin. And it would have been a great number of people dying after the war had ended had this humanitarian effort not been conducted. Ultimately, the Western allies did not give in, and the Soviets ended their blockade in May of 1949. The Berlin airlift kept going for a few months into the late summer, early fall, just to build up the stock of supplies in Berlin, West Berlin, so that if the Soviets were to try this again, they would have some supplies ready until a second airlift could be organized. Fortunately, this never happened. And shortly after the blockade officially ended, also in May of 1949, these three Western zones formally united into the Federal Republic of Germany, better known during this time as West Germany. After the three Western zones united and the airlift concluded, finally the Soviet zone was declared as the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany, of course. So at this point, the German nation was officially in two states. Separation of the German nation into two states continued as the new norm, lasting a little over 40 years from the two states' creation until reunification on October 3rd, 1990. Even once both states recognized each other's existence, they both still spoke of a single German nation. Now, tensions fluctuated, risking war at various times, including during when the only violent uprising occurred in East Germany in 1953, as well as when the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961, this being one of the famous tanks face-offs from the Berlin garrison of the US Army and the Soviets facing off from East Berlin over the famous checkpoint Charlie. Now, that's not to say it was always a bad state of relations between the two Germanys. They did have some moments of genuine cooperation. For a number of years, since we just concluded the Winter Olympics, a number of years, the two Germanys sent a united team of Germany to the Olympics. Somewhat similar, perhaps, to the more recent efforts by the two Koreas to jointly operate an Olympic team together. So while they were separate states, they still spoke of being one nation of Germans. So hanging over all this of these 40 years was a simple fact. Germany was two states with one nation. And while the official history of the two Germanys ended in 1990, when East Germany joined the Federal Republic of Germany as 5 new federal states, as well as Berlin now made one whole city again, merging into a 16th state, 16 with the Western states combined. The history does not end there. Eastern Germany, so let me rephrase this. Eastern Germany today is still a very different place from its Western half, with significantly weaker economics, cultural differences, and very different politics. Many East Germans still leave their home in the Eastern states and move to the far wealthier Western states. All of this is to say, I want to leave you with this final thought. While history is a story, the story of us, of humankind, and seemingly has an endpoint, October 3rd, 1990 in this case, when the two Germanys reunited, or perhaps a little bit earlier in November of '89 when the Berlin Wall came down and that process began. History never truly ends. Every moment in history, every moment is history, however minor it may seem, and every moment is affected by what came before it. World War I and World War II are still impacting the world today, decades after these events. The stark contrast between the German halves, which we can see the economic difference between these Eastern states and the wealthier Western states, or the population density of East Germany compared to the far larger West Germany. These are consequences and results of the world wars. So there's a stark contrast in Germany today with the two former halves, and that's my example now. But let me leave you with this. And the next time that you wonder why something is the way it is today, consider what came before and how far-reaching effects of events that took place decades or even centuries before may be. I thank you all for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. We have about 12 minutes or so.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great.
I'm going to just throw out, because I find it interesting, one of the interesting aspects of the difference between East Germany and West Germany that might mean something to some of you is that for most of the existence of unified Germany, in the German top league of soccer, there were no teams from the East until fairly recently when Red Bull threw boatloads of money at a team in Leipzig. And now there's one. And it sort of is demonstrating the difference in money between East and West Germany. Is there's not enough money in the East to have a soccer team in the first division until Austrians came along.
That's an excellent example of how just how Germany still to this day is a divided country, divided yet not.
I would throw out another thing that I find really interesting about this story is the Austrians. The idea that there's an Austrian nationality comes about after 1945. That didn't exist before that. And it was really convenient after 1945 not to be German and to be something else. And that's, I think, fascinating. We're victims of those Germans.
Even though so many of us welcomed them. Yeah. As you know or may know, Andrew, my area of interest is ancient Greece and Rome, and so I was struck early on when you showed the map of matters German that goes so far. What do we know? And I should know this, but I don't. What do we know about how far back there's evidence of language that's German? I'm aware that while you think about that, the Latin texts speak of the word Germania. They speak of the Franks, but I don't know what evidence we have or when we begin to have evidence of written evidence, because I think these were pre-state, pre-literate peoples in Caesar's time and in most of the Roman Empire. Same in Spain. I mean, it's a similar question. There were certainly peoples and civilization, but the record I don't know about. So when do we think we have something that's German, that's the language German?
That's a difficult question to answer because you're right. There is not much in the way of record keeping when you go back that far for that
Right.
part of the world.
Right.
A good chunk of our early German knowledge comes from things like the Romans, who traded with a number of the tribes and launched various military campaigns over the years. And while they never completely conquered the territory that they called Germania, or at least that's how you say it in German anyway. I don't know how you say it in Latin. We get things like Tacitus and his text, the Germania, that describes some of the ancient Germanic peoples.
Right.
That's one of the older ones that I can think of off the top of my head, although it's one of those questionable sources as far as, to my understanding, and you might be able to speak more to this, Tacitus did not, he did not spend, a lot, he did not actually go and live among the Germanic peoples.
I'm not aware that he did either, but Yoandi might know. But of course, he's the conqueror. He's not the people themselves. But so when we have the first evidence of language, now I can't recite to you when we do in English, but I know I have some books here that will tell me. the etymology books. I could come up with them if I had to, but I don't know when we have the first formation, the first text evidence of German. That's okay if it's.
Yeah, I don't know what
okay. We can let it go. Others may have questions.
Okay.
No, and it may
Jules
not
has a
it's not well
follow-up
known.
too.
Okay, thanks.
Stephanie, Jules has a follow-up to yours. He
Okay.
says, does Caesar speak Germania or only Gallia?
Oh, see.
Oh, I should have seen.
Well, the difference between them isn't all that clear.
Yeah.
This whole area is called Celtic. They called themselves Celts, or the Romans called them Celts as well, and the Celts retreated north much later. So it's
and even what we call the ancient Germans is not a clear picture, and this kind of gets to why in languages today there is no singular term for German. There are, of course, many different origins of various languages, names for Germans. Even the word German, or the German word for German, Deutsch or Deutsche, these both come from the various tribes that existed that had various names. In Spanish and other Romance languages, German is, of course, Alemania. That refers to a tribe that settled in what is modern-day Switzerland and maybe a little bit of southern Germany in Baden. And to this day, the Swiss dialect of German is referred to as Alemannisch, having the same linguistic origins as the Spanish name for the language and people. At least some of the Slavic languages refer to Germans as the people who can't speak, or something to that effect, derived from the ancient Proto-Slavic language describing the ancient, Proto-Germans when they first encountered each other. The ancient Germans spoke a different language than the ancient Slavs and thus couldn't initially communicate. So you get the people who can't speak or people who can't hear, something to that effect, to describe them.
I would throw in, when is there a German language? It relates to your question, and that's basically Martin Luther. Martin Luther translates the Bible, the New Testament, into German, and that's the moment where there becomes a German that all the Germans then start to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, they don't have a language that's in common. So, when is there a German culture, a German language? Well, there isn't one maybe until 1517 or a bit after.
Yeah, the translation of the Bible by Luther is where we can trace modern German ultimately to. We do have some German language, old, ancient German Old High German, Middle High German, getting into all that stuff, the different evolution of the German language. We do have some documents that predate Luther, of course, going back to the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingians and whatnot. We have the Oaths of Strasbourg, for example, in 842, 843, thereabouts, one of which was in whatever version of Old German, and the other one was in the equivalent oath in Old, basically French. There are various Germanic tales, as well as ones in going into Old English, things like Beowulf and whatnot, that have similarities, linguistic and etymological similarities to the other Western Germanic speakers.
I have a comment. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I have a comment and a question at the same time. It might look as a joke, but it is not. A friend of mine in Berlin, I was visiting Berlin in 2008. Oh my God. I mean, in my previous life. And and I remember he told me he was from the east side of Berlin. And he told me, well, the wall fell down because we didn't have bananas. if we had bananas here, we wouldn't have done anything against the wall, something like that. And I was like shocked, because coming from a German person from my age, by the way, he was born same year, 1982. So he's almost 40 right now. And at that moment, he was like, I don't know, 27, 26. So from someone who was my age and coming from, a democratic family, or a family from the democratic area of Berlin, I was surprised because of that. And I just wanted to ask you both, Andrew and Edward, if you have heard something like that before, if it makes sense or whatever.
That's actually a good personal anecdote, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I see one of the other people in this call is my professor from UW Oshkosh, Dr. Michelle Mouton. She told a very similar story in one of my various German or European history classes I had with her 10 plus years ago. And what that speaks to, the example of bananas, is that the economics of the Warsaw Pact, of the Eastern Bloc, were very poor compared to the NATO bloc. And being unable to get bananas was just one example of a good that was very hard to come by. And when East Germany was in existence, there would be times where, and this I think is actually something that Dr. Mouton specifically told us in one of her classes, you'd be walking on the street somewhere in Germany, East Germany, and you'd see people lining up, and at a store, you'd get into line because there was something there. You had no idea what there was, but there was something. So you'd wait in line and try to get whatever it was. Maybe you'd be hoping it'd be bananas, and you'd end up walking away with a toaster. Whatever it was, you were just excited that you could get something. And that's, the images of empty store shelves in crisis hit places today. That was a common sight in East Germany and other parts of the former Eastern Bloc.
That raises a question to me. Is the United States solid today because people believe in freedom and democracy, or is it solid today because we're fairly economically okay?
I'd be more inclined to say, this is just a guess on my part, that economics would ultimately play a large part of it. if we have, warm homes, if we have food in our bellies, if we're able to, get our cars and fill them with gas, that is a reflection on the state of current affairs. And if we can have these things, then people are less likely to be angry and end up having protests or revolutions that happen in other places.
I think that points us to the discourse of the nation, though. So it isn't just economic, right? If there's this.
Yeah, I mean, as with everything, it's can't be boiled down to a single variable.
Right.
But I would say economics ends up being a strong part of much of the well-being of a country.
Right. And creating unrest and division and conflict and competition, etc.
The banana makes a good story also. It's less complicated to talk about than the fact that there was no democracy and you couldn't assemble and you couldn't read and you couldn't do all kinds of other things that you also couldn't do.
Professor Mouton, it's wonderful to have you with us.
This very nice talk.
I agree. So any other questions for Andrew today?
That was
Well,
actually
Tony,
before we got onto the question of Germania, I was going to say one of the interesting things to think about when you're talking about the East is also that Merkel was in there for 16 years and she was from the East. And yet, despite the fact that she was in there very successfully for 16 years, she wasn't able to really erase the kind of divisions that you were describing.
Did that come up in her, like, in her political discourse again about her stepping down?
I've not been following the most recent German politics too closely as far as the transition from Merkel to Scholz or as part of the German election campaign. Either Professors Mouton or Matthew, have either of you followed that more closely?
I just finished reading her a biography of her that points out that at the end of her life, she really did start talking more and being more aware about the divisions between the East. I think for a long time, she was just trying to represent the country and sort of overlook those divisions and claim that if you tried hard enough, you could overcome them. Whereas by the end, she was much more sensitive. I think in part in response to the fact that there's such a strong extreme right-wing party, that AfD. But I don't know how Olaf Scholz has been talking about it, so I can't really speak to that. Maybe the other person could.
I think, I mean, I agree with what Michelle said entirely, but I don't think as she was stepping down in the politics around her stepping down, that was an issue at all. It was about economics and it was about immigration and various other things I don't think it was part of the conversation at all.
Well, this has been fascinating, Andrew. This is fantastic. We hope to continue hearing from you this way. It's so fascinating. So it made me start looking up all sorts of things while you were talking too, and remembering, sort of when my own background in colonial history, a lot of that also went back to some of the roots that you're talking about. So, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again, Andrew, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Professor Mouton. Sorry, your chat is Mouton, for joining us from Oshkosh. I feel very fondly about Wisconsin. so it's wonderful to have you with us. And we hope to see you all again soon. And next week, we have a presentation also on Monday at 3 o'clock. Dr. Kathy Headley I'm going to remember from memory the title of her talk is Happy Birthday, Title IX, Let's Talk Rockford University. We hope to see you here next week. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.